She is a graduate of the University of California,
the author of the forthcoming book, A Skeptic's Guide to Islam,
and a blogger at Skeptic,
Heina
Dadabhoy.
Alrighty, thanks for sticking around and not running off to lunch. You know, that sounds appealing to all of us at this point, I'm sure. My talk is, the title's kind of silly, Virgins, Raisins, and Sexy Serving Boys. But essentially, I'm going to be talking about Muslim women and sexuality and what that means. So for the most part, I would say that the discourse about Muslim women and their sexuality is dominated entirely by viewing women as objects. And we do this without realizing it sometimes, but I was talking about my talk, which is wont to happen when you're running around doing all kinds of stuff, and every time I would mention the subject of my talk, not just the title would elicit a half-hearted chuckle, but the description would usually elicit someone saying something along the lines of, oh, those poor Muslim women, they have to be all veiled and stuff. And in a way, they're perpetuating what Islam wants you to think about women. You're just rolling with it, where it's not about the Muslim women's agency or their sexuality or their feelings about their sexuality. It's all about the male gaze and covering up women. So the focus is really on the body. Instead of focusing on, women's desires, women's preferences, women's experiences, they focus on what's she wearing. That's where the focus goes. I will quote a speaker from a conference that I will not name, and I won't name the speaker either, but he essentially said, and I'm quoting, that in some places they stuff their women into bags and beat them, and he put up a picture of women in burqas. And to me, that's not really helpful in bringing about anything close to understanding or change. It's merely pointing and saying, oh, those guys do that. It denies their agency. It denies their agency as women. You can't force people to choose the version of freedom that you prefer. You cannot say to a person, well, I prefer that you dress with a little bit less fabric. You can't really do that. That's not real freedom if you're imposing it on them. And then some people will, of course, hear that argument and say, well, how much are they actually choosing it? And I know in certain countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, women are forced to wear the full covering. They're forced to wear face coverings and head coverings and loose clothing. But there are plenty of countries and plenty of Muslim women, even in countries where there's laws about it, who will look you in the face. If you're a woman, they won't look a man in the eye. That's against the rules. But if you're a woman, they'll look you in the eye and say, I choose this. This is what I want. I want to cover myself. I want to have a relationship with my God in that way. What are you going to say? No, you're actually not choosing. No, you don't know anything. There are lots of things that we do in Western society. I'm saying we because I am a Californian born and raised. There's lots of things that we do. How much of a choice is it? As an American Muslim, I didn't feel very pressured to cover because most American Muslim women don't, I'd say. There's no hard data on it. Some women put it on and take it off, and some of them do it in kind of a sort of halfway sort of way. But as an American Muslim, I didn't feel at all forced to wear a headscarf. I liked it. I liked, when I was religious, to feel that connection to my religion and my philosophy and my worldview, because Islam is really a way of life. It dominates everything. But once I deveiled, I suddenly started to realize that there's all kinds of patriarchal pressures from secular society, from American society, things like body hair. How much of a choice do you have to not remove your body hair if you choose to show the parts of your body that have hair? Especially if you're brown like me and have, we're not exactly hairless. The hair isn't blonde either. So, how much of a choice do I have to leave my armpits shaggy? Do I? And that's where we get into the different kinds of pressure that exists for women, the different ways of enforcing patriarchy. There's legal, like in Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., where they are legally forced to do something. And obviously that's the most egregious, and that should not be there, clearly. And even as a Muslim, when I was a Muslim, I believed that laws should not enforce religion because it diluted the practice of Islam. Because if you're forced by law or forced by terror with these morality police running around beating you, if you're forced by law or by terror to cover up, how does that say anything about what covering up means? Because covering up is supposed to mean that you have a relationship with your God. So to me, that was my view. But then there's also sort of soft pressure. There's soft pressure in society where people mock you, criticize you, completely pass you over for certain opportunities, romantic and otherwise, based on the way you look. And that's something that we deal with everywhere. So patriarchy and oppressive societal structures are everywhere. I'm sure we can all agree on that in some way. And playing the game of which is worse isn't necessarily the best way to go about it either, but obviously the legal stuff should be changed. The problem is when we talk about Muslim women is we cannot divorce talking about Islam, and especially talking about Muslim women, from the legacy of colonialism. We cannot do that. It is an integral part of that history. There is what we call the Western savior complex, where the heroic white man shows up and is better than the people of that ethnicity at the stuff that's special to that ethnicity, like The Last Samurai or Dances with Wolves. It's like this guy who's a complete outsider shows up and somehow he's better at doing what these people's culture is than those people are. And he just magically saves everybody and everything's great. When you add gender to the mix, it gets really icky. And I mean really icky. I recently found a Tumblr called creepywhiteguys.tumblr.com, and it's dedicated to the creepy messages that Asian American women receive from white men on OkCupid. And the messages sometimes are in Chinese if they know Chinese, sometimes they're in English. Often they express something along the lines of, oh man, those Asian men are just so tyrannical and awful. Come, let me save you with my white maleness. And it's just, and even if you are interested in dating someone of a different race and you are a white guy, don't use your race as a pickup line. You probably have more, give yourself a little credit. There's probably more to you than just being a white dude. You probably have something to sell yourself on besides, I'm white and your people are not, let's bang. There's probably something better to offer. I personally have gotten, when I used to have my ethnicity on my online dating profile listed as Indian, oh boy. Did your mom teach you about Kama Sutra? Yeah, this is not just one message, by the way. I have gotten ridiculous amounts of messages that reference either Kama Sutra or Tantra or both. And to me, it was hilarious because I'm not even of Hindu background, that's all Hindu stuff. My family's adamantly anti-Hindu. It's kind of side note, but my dad made sure that we had meat at every meal because we are not Hindu. We eat meat. So I didn't know anything about Kama Sutra or Tantra until I came out of Islam, and I was like, oh, let me look at this whole heritage thing, India stuff. All right, let's check it out. But before that, I had no idea what all that stuff was. And then I removed my ethnicity from my profile, and then I got the assumers, people who assumed what my race was. But it all came down to the idea that these white men assumed that they were better options for me than what they assumed my options were, which were men of my own ethnicity, which, I live in a multicultural state and area. I'm not limited to my own race. In fact, if I did that, I'd have far fewer choices. And it comes down to them saying things like, we're better than those guys are. So it becomes you are women, you are property, you are not treated very well by your current property owners, let's give you better ones. That's essentially what that argument comes down to. And it plays into what these men claim to be against, which is seeing female sexuality only in relation to men and women as property of men. Because if you're going to argue against, oh, these men treat you badly, why not take that a step further and afford the woman her own agency? Say, you are a person, you are a human being, and I respect you and want to connect to you as a human being. And I bring up dating because it's the most obvious example, but this sort of thing runs as a thread through a lot of people's interactions. Oh, those poor, poor oppressed women. And true, there are places where there are poor, poor oppressed women. I do not want to diminish that struggle. But to be a happily veiled, at the time, obviously not anymore, my hair's showing, right? To be a fairly happily veiled Muslim woman, just, la-di-da, going to the grocery store or whatever, and someone says, you poor dear. This has happened more than once. This happened many times when I was growing up. You poor dear, did you just immigrate? You don't have to wear that here. It's okay. Free yourself. And I'm looking at her going, no. In my very California-sounding Valley Girl way. And then they would get surprised and say, your English is very good. Well, I'd hope so. I did major in English, I hope I can speak it all right. I talk good. It does come back to Islam itself, though. Islam itself does frame female sexuality almost exclusively as in relation to male sexuality. Male sexuality, too, there's very little discussion of desire in a positive way, but at least it's discussed. At least Muhammad would tell people, there'd be men who would say things like, I'm too poor to get married, what should I do? And he would say, fast. Because when you're starving, you don't have energy for anything else. But that was Muhammad's recommendation to men, that if you are too poor to get married and your lust is just out of whack, just crazy, then fast. Fast until you are, I guess you could save money on food by fasting and then you could afford to get married. I don't know. And then also, like I said, physically exhaust yourself. Try not eating or drinking any water from sunrise to sunset and then talk about how horny you might be. You won't be. All you care about is food. That's all you want to do is eat. But there's nothing about women. There's very little about women having desire. In terms of sexuality, the way it's discussed for men and women, it's mostly a list of you can't do this. And most people who come out of the Abrahamic faiths, those dastardly little pesky things that keep popping up all the time, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, there is that sort of sense of sexuality is mostly discussed as a list of do's and don'ts. You can't do this, you can't do that. Mostly the no's, though. With Islam, there's prohibitions on who men can and can't have sex with. So obviously relatives, which actually includes parents and grandparents, siblings of parents, children and grandchildren, they're down. And it's either if you're biologically related to them or if you have been breastfed by them. So back then they used to have wet nurses who would breastfeed their children. So if you nursed with someone, their family basically became your family and you could not marry into them. It's interesting to note, though, that cousins or uncles by marriage or your spouse's siblings are not included in this. So because technically you're allowed to marry them, you do have to cover in front of them. Family gatherings got weird after we hit puberty, let me say. Couldn't have my guy cousins anymore and had to wear a scarf in front of them. It got weird. And there's a few ex-Muslim women who've written about this, and they talk about this hypersexualization, this feeling of as soon as you hit puberty, you're nothing but this sex object, even to people in your own family, and so you have to cover in front of them. It's unpleasant to say the least. Legalistically speaking, within Islam, a Muslim woman is prohibited from sex with a man who doesn't have a marriage contract with her. The word nikah in Islam doesn't just mean wedding or marriage, it means contract. There's a contract that they draw up, and there are a few basic provisions, and you can add to them. And some very savvy Muslim women will add things like, if your income ever drops below $100,000 a year, I can divorce you. Or I had my marriage contract planned out at age 14, and in it was going to be, if you marry another woman, I get to vet her first. It wasn't, you can't marry another woman. But I'll get back to the polygamy thing later. So a Muslim woman cannot have sex, well, she could, I guess, but she's prohibited from having sex with a man who doesn't have a marriage contract with her. But there's another situation where a Muslim woman can have sex with a man, and that is if he's her owner. Muslim men are allowed to have sex with their slaves, their female slaves, without any limits. No limits imposed. And that always bothered me. I mean, I didn't exactly stamp my foot and say, I want no part of your Islam. I mean, I wasn't that cool yet, but it always bothered me that Muslim men can have sex with their slaves. And Muslims today, if you bring this up, they'll say, well, there's no slavery anymore, which is a lie. There is slavery, and in many Muslim countries. And these Muslim men do rape their house servants with alarming frequency, especially in Saudi Arabia. Muslim men can have sex with their slaves, whether they're Muslim or not. They can have up to 4 wives who are Muslim. And in terms of non-Muslim women, they can have unlimited concubines. That's what they call them. Muhammad had a concubine himself who was a Coptic Christian woman. So, there's a lot of limits on female sexuality there, not so much for men. I've heard some progressive Muslims argue that there is a loophole in all of this. In Islam, in order to prove a crime, you have to have 4 witnesses, and they have to be 4 male witnesses, and that's for sexual crimes. If they're female, then 2 women equals 1 man, so do the math there. If it's 4 men, then it's 8 women. That's actually become a problem recently because everyone loves bringing it up and Muslims don't know what to say. What do you say to that? 2 to 1 ratio? Not so good. But because there have to be 4 male witnesses, some progressive Muslims will argue, that means you can have all the sex you want, just make sure 4 men never see it. Well, okay, that's not how it usually works out, because women generally bear the stigma of premarital or extramarital sex of any kind, and rape as well. So yeah, there's a lot of discussion of marriage in terms of male sexual desire. To get back to polygamy a little bit, polygyny, as it's more accurately called, because polygamy just means multiple marriage with any number of men and or women, but polygyny means multiple wives. So in this polygynous structure, Muslim men are allowed to have up to 4 wives, but they do have to treat each one equally. So if you get a diamond ring, a BMW, and a mansion for wife number 1, guess what wife number 2 gets? That's why most Muslim men just are like, no. No, thank you. Especially when they're in the middle class. When they're poor or rich, they tend to be more open to polygyny, but it's pretty rare. Even in my family, it was incredibly rare. I only have one polygynous relative I know of in the past 3 or 4 generations, and that was because his first wife was unable to have children. So he married a second wife so he could have children. And remarkably, the 2 women got along pretty well. They had separate houses in San Francisco. And my uncle went between them, and when he passed away, a lot of my family, met the first wife and she was a very nice lady, and they, even at her funeral, a bunch of my family went, even though they weren't biologically related. So it worked out, but it doesn't always, of course. I personally, to go back to what I was saying earlier, when I was a Muslim, polygyny sounded great to me. I didn't want to be a housewife, so I figured me and hubby could marry a housewife, and she could take care of all the chores and the housework and the children. And we could all, me and him would come home from earning the halal turkey bacon, and we would, put the kids to bed, and then we'd all snuggle on the couch and go, aw, and it would be so cute. I had this complete scenario mapped out in my head. And then I realized later that I didn't just want to cuddle with her too. Yeah, not very Muslim of me. To get to the virgins, the infamous virgins of the Islamic paradise, they're called Huris or Hurain, which means it literally translates to something like the beauty of the eyes, like they're just really nice to look at. And it's also kind of a pun because in that time in Arab society, the epitome of female beauty included a very specific thing, and that is very, very white whites of the eyes with very clear dark lines to mark out the pupils. So that was considered to be the height of beauty. That and big thighs and small waist, like there was a lot of stuff that went into that. But just the eyes, it was compared to like an egg when you crack it open. So there's the white of the egg, and then you can see the yolk very clearly. That was the epitome of beauty. What can we say? What's the epitome of beauty now? There's some weird stuff we're into as a society. They were considered to be the perfect reward for Muslim men. So first off, to clear up the 72 thing, it's not a specific number. The 72 essentially means, like, if I said to you, if I told you once, I told you 1,000 times. It's just, I've told you so many times. So 72 virgins is so many virgins, more than you could ever want. And at the time, including in Western society up until fairly recently, female virgins were considered to be the epitome of sexual experience. Men would be like, yeah, she's just completely untouched and pure, and that's what I want. And now people make jokes about it like, oh, who would want a virgin? She doesn't know what she's doing, but that was what they wanted back then. They're not raisins either. And the reason I bring this up is because Irshad Manji, who's a lesbian Muslim, and a bunch of other progressive Muslims bring this up. They're like, oh, it's a mistranslation. It's not actually virgins, it's white raisins. The only person to have put out this theory is a long discredited French historian who didn't really know what he was talking about in terms of the language. So it's not raisins. Let's just clear that one up. It is sexy ladies in heaven, not raisins. They're considered to be beautiful, obviously. They're not earthly people either. It's not that the virgins on earth die and become heavenly virgins. So don't worry, you won't have to have sex with a bunch of people who are just really awkward or something. Or who didn't like sex. Some people could die virgins because they don't like sex, and then why would you want to have sex with them in heaven? They're created by Allah. They're heavenly sex bots. Allah created them just for the sexual pleasure of men. And in fact, in the Quran and the Hadith, it says that they're created specifically for the Muslim man who is going to die and end up with them. So these are fake women created just to please a man. Does it surprise you that a man wrote this religion? Come on. Come on! But anyway, there's a saying in Muhammad where he tells women not to admonish their husbands, not to chastise their husbands, and to be nice to them, because the Huris in heaven are looking down on them and saying, you just got him for a lifetime, we get him forever, stop abusing him. So these are supposed to be kind of, they might be Allah-created sex bots, but they have some personality, clearly, if they're, being sassy to the earthly women. The fate of earthly wives is something that I think really highlights how Islamic sexuality for women is really predicated around men. Because if, let's say you're, your average Muslim woman, you're married, you have kids, all that good stuff. Your husband dies and he goes, well, he doesn't go to heaven yet, because in Islam there's like a day of judgment that's going to come, but that's all its own talk probably. So say your husband gets this harem of Huris, what happens to you? Well, if he remembers to call you, he calls you and you guys get to be in heaven together, along with the Huris. But if he forgets, well, there's a couple of options. One of them is the one that's most commonly stated in the Quran, and that is lounging on plush couches, like very harem girl imagery, with very beautiful young men serving you food. Anything else, maybe? I don't know what else they'd be serving. I wondered that as a young Muslim girl, would these sexy serving boys get to serve me as well? But no. There's nothing in the Quran that implies that or says that, but there's some people who like to think that that's the case. It's a nice thought, right? The other option is if you're a Muslim woman and your husband doesn't get into heaven, or you're a Muslim woman and you die without having married, you could be assigned to one of the holy men of the past. So you could join up with Muhammad's harem, or Moses' harem, or Jesus' harem, or Adam's harem, all these figures in the Quran. You could end up being one of their wives. And I remember as a young girl, people talk about, which guy in NSYNC would you rather be with? We were actually sitting and saying, if we die before we get married, which of the prophets would we want to bone in heaven? This is a conversation I've had. So, despite Islam's erasure of female sexuality, clearly we still had a sexuality. The flip side of that, though, is that all the ignoring of female sexuality in Islam led me to think that there was something wrong with me. Because all the admonishments against desire, against adultery, which in Islam the definition of adultery is not just sex after you're married with someone who you're not married to. It's sex before marriage with someone who you're not going to marry because you're cheating on your future spouse. So we always heard it as adultery rather than fornication. The two concepts are sort of married, no pun intended, in Islam. So, the idea of adultery it was always for men. It was always them saying, men are the ones who have to lower their gaze in Islam. Because women have to cover, but men have to lower their gaze and guard their modesty. And if a Muslim man looks at a woman, that first glance is considered to be for him. He's allowed to have it. But then, he's not supposed to look at her again. And so there's a comic I saw online, maybe I should have brought it, but this guy, Maniac Muslim, he's a Muslim humorist, and he drew a comic where the guy just has his eyes this big and he keeps staring at the girl. The girl's like, why are you staring at me? He said, I'm making the first gaze count. So it was always at men, and I remember thinking, well, I like looking at cute boys, and I want to have sex, so what's wrong with me? My first thought was, am I gay? Because I wanted to have sex with men a lot. Because that was the only thing I could think of that was deviating from the norm was, I must be a lesbian or something. I don't know. I tortured myself over this. I asked I couldn't really ask my mother. What was I gonna say? Hey mom, I'm super horny. Is there something wrong with me? No, I wasn't gonna do that. And then my religious teachers, I also felt shy about talking about these things with. And then there were, a lot of them were men too. I wasn't gonna go up to like my male imam or sheikh or whatever and say, Sheikh, I'm really horny. What am I supposed to do? So, what is a Muslim girl to do? Deconvert, clearly. But not all Muslim women are gonna deconvert. And that's the sad reality. When I first left Islam, I was convinced that I had come up with these completely unique arguments that nobody had ever thought of. And if I just told everybody, they would get it and go, How stupid of us. We totally missed that part. You're so smart, Heina. Here's an award for eradicating Islam from the world. Spoiler alert, that never happened. So instead, I had to consider how to help reform Islam, which as an outsider now, and the worst kind of outsider who used to be an insider, I can't really do much directly. I can try to educate non-Muslims, which is a big part of what I do in my activism, but I can't really go to Muslims and say, hey guys, I have this idea, because they say dirty heathen, whatever. No, they don't really say dirty heathen, that's what I imagine them saying. What they actually say is look at me and say, you have no right to talk about this. Okay, fair point, you're mad at me, I get it, you're mad. But what I can do as an ex-Muslim, and what a lot of y'all can do too as atheists, is support Muslim progressives. As much as we don't like to talk about religious progressives, and as much as I think we atheists like to make fun of them, at least they're making some headway, at least they're sort of robbing religion of its more harmful elements, and hopefully we can get it to the point where it's like Europe, where people go to church but it doesn't really mean anything. I would love for that to happen to Islam. You know, I would love for that to happen to Islam, and I want to facilitate that with the utmost of my ability. So there are people who are already doing that work. One of them is Shireen El-Feki, who I got a chance to hear in LA. She did a talk about her book, which is called Sex and the Citadel. She went to Egypt and she interviewed women of all ages, marital statuses, you name it, and just told their experiences. Because we're not at the point where we can really collect hard, good data on Muslim women and their sexuality, but we can collect anecdotes, we can collect stories, we can shed some light onto this. Geraldine Brooks wrote a book called 9 Parts of Desire, which is similar, except she was kind of an outsider coming in. Shireen El-Feki knows Arabic, and she's an Egyptian, so I think that sort of lends itself a little bit better. But Geraldine Brooks, no shade to her. You know, she did something pretty revolutionary. I found a book online. I haven't read it, so don't take this as an endorsement. I don't know if it's any good, but it's called The Almond: The Sexual Awakening of a Muslim Woman. And it's by someone who goes by the pen name of Nejma. She's out of Morocco, and it's actually Muslim erotica, and it's based on her real life. There's a book called Love Inshallah. Inshallah means if God wills it. And Love Inshallah was actually written in the United States. It was edited and pulled together in the United States. So it's about Muslim immigrants and the children of Muslim immigrants. They have a pretty active website and blog too. I actually really enjoyed Love Inshallah. The blog's really interesting. There was a really sweet poem someone wrote recently about how, in Ramadan, the prohibition isn't just on eating and drinking, it's also on sex. You're not supposed to have sex while you fast. So it's a really sweet poem about innocently spooning with your husband during Ramadan during the day, because you're both tired from the fast, and so you're having a nap together and you're cuddling, but you can't have sex, so it becomes this sort of just an intimacy thing. It was cute. And then there's Wadad Lutha and Heba Qutb. And they're both marriage counselors, and they have actually been considered revolutionary in the Middle East for talking openly about sex. And they actually were part of the movement that started actual sex stores and sex products being sold to Muslim couples in the Middle East. And they don't do the whole vibrator dildo thing, that's not allowed. But they'll do, massage oils or, the lighter kinky stuff like blindfolds and things like that. Lubes, that sort of thing, cute underwear. But that alone is just such a huge step forward. I know that Wadad Lutha wrote a book, and it was translated, and it's called Top Secret Sexual Guidance for Married Couples. And Heba Qutb, I don't think she has a book out yet, but every week she has a syndicated sex advice show where people call in and she answers questions about sex. This is completely unheard of not so long ago in the Middle East. There's Fatima Mernissi, who's a Moroccan Muslim feminist. Her writing, I cannot recommend it enough. She grew up in Morocco. She grew up in a traditional harem setup in the household where there's the women's side and the men's side. And she talks about how that affected her. And she recently, meaning a couple years ago, wrote an article about how size 6 is the American woman's harem. Where size 6 is basically, that's what women are confined to in the United States. If you're not a size 6, you can't shop at most stores that are nicer and things like that. And she remembers being shocked the first time she went to shop at an American store because she wasn't a size 6, she didn't know what size she was, because in those countries they generally send their measurements to a tailor and get their clothing. And, you know, men in the Middle East, you know, appreciated her body, and she suddenly comes to the United States, and this woman around her age is looking at her with a sneer of disdain saying, we don't carry your size here. So she has a really interesting East-West perspective. There's Amina Wadud. She's an African-American Muslim feminist, and she actually led the first, that we know of, woman-led prayer that had men and women following her. Because in Islam, men can lead a prayer of men and women, and a woman can lead a prayer of women, but women aren't supposed to lead a prayer with men and women. And women are supposed to be behind the men because, you know, when you bend over when you pray, I guess the butts are too tempting. Even though everyone's in loose robes, you can't see shit. Trust me, I tried. Didn't work out. Didn't work out too well. And then there are lots of progressive and LGBT Muslim groups. That might be hard to believe, an LGBT Muslim group. There's a group called Al-Fatiha, which is a gay men's group. It's been around for years. I thought it was a recent development until I remembered back when I was maybe 10 or 11, my cousin saying, you know, when I was at school, we heard about these dudes named Al-Fatiha, and they fast and they pray, but they're gay. And I remember dismissing it out of hand. Bullshit, made up, Zionist conspiracy. The Jews are trying to frame us. By the way, according to Twitter, I'm paid off by the Zionist conspiracy. If any of you have any contact with the Zionist conspiracy, please ask them to send the check soon. I'm pretty broke. So that's, so there's LGBT Muslim groups as well. And with, when it comes to homosexuality, I'll get into that in a second. But to go back to how Muslim women feel, to think about the work that Shireen al-Faqih does, and other people do. You know, despite the oppressiveness, despite the suppression, despite the sheer erasure of female desire within the context of Islam, it still happens. You cannot kill human nature. You cannot kill how most people are sexual beings. Polygyny, like I mentioned, has its potential benefits that I saw. And then there's the Four Witnesses Law, which has a potential to lend itself towards privacy. But there's also the part where women cover. I saw it as an act of sexual agency and rebellion in the United States, because I saw my peers, you know, I'm sure, you know, apologies if this seems flippant, but you know, if I'd gone into the bathroom in high school and heard someone puking into a toilet, and she puked into the toilet every day. There were young women I knew who felt pressured to have sex because their boyfriends wanted them to, and they were afraid they would get left by their boyfriends if they didn't have sex. There were gay women I knew who were afraid to come out. So there was this sense that women in general have problems with sexuality and sexual expression. So for me to choose to wear the headscarf, which I did choose, my parents did not pressure me. I was far more devout and religious than my parents when I was religious, which is why it was such a shock that I turned out to be the atheist. Although to y'all, probably not. You know, most of you probably read the Bible and became atheists, so it was similar for me. You know, actually reading the Quran and going, not so much. But to me, wearing the hijab, covering up my body, was a way to escape the scrutiny, the intense, relentless scrutiny of the Western conception of the male gaze. You know, I was never a small girl. I was never a skinny girl. And it bothered me because, you know, when I was a little kid, kids teased me. But usually that becomes worse after you hit puberty. You hit puberty and you worry about dating, you worry about sex, you worry about being attractive. For me, puberty was a relief because then I could cover up, and the kids in my class were old enough to where they wouldn't call me fat to make fun of me, so I didn't have to think about it anymore. The only times I had to think about it were maybe in the shower, but I showered in the dark, true story, and I didn't really have to worry about it. I didn't have to deal with it. It wasn't my concern. And I knew that marriage would happen for me because I was a good Muslim girl and I kept myself pure, so some boy, I'm sure, would have scooped me up, right? That's what I thought. So for me, hijab was a way to control my sexuality. Obviously, in some ways that were unhealthy because of the body image issues, but nonetheless, it was a way for me to feel in control of myself. And there are Muslim women who feel that way. Another way that Muslim women feel is sometimes to take certain verses of the Quran and prioritize them above the other. And the lesbian Muslim who I mentioned, Irshad Manji, does that. She takes the verse in the Quran where it says that Allah created everybody to be perfect and says, well, he created me to be a lesbian, I must be perfect. So that's her specific way of going about it. I was actually once unfavorably compared to Irshad Manji. I went to a mosque, my parents were dragging me around to different mosques, trying to, see which imam would bring some sense to me. And they wouldn't even look me in the face. I'm like, how can we have a conversation, man? But I knew why they weren't looking me in the face. It's the whole modesty law stuff. But I was sitting there and the guy mentioned Irshad Manji, and I said, why are you mentioning her positively? She's a lesbian. He says, well, she might live in the basement, but at least she's still in the house. The idea being, she's still within the confines of Islam, but she's in the bad, low place. But at least she's still a Muslim. And I went, okay, so you're promoting hypocrisy? And then the conversation went downhill from there. And his ultimate argument, of course, was, you should just have faith. Well, okay. We all know how we feel about that. There's also no specific prohibition on female masturbation in Islam. None whatsoever. Some of the prohibitions on masturbation come from a verse in the Quran that says that the use of your genitals is reserved for your spouses, which some people interpret to mean you can't use them either. But don't you have pleasure when you have sex with your spouse? I'd imagine that you would, right? So that doesn't really hold, and there's plenty of Muslims who acknowledge that masturbation isn't expressly prohibited in Islam. They will sort of go from the angle of it's adultery if you're thinking about someone who's not your spouse while you're masturbating. So, it's like, what if your mind goes blank? What if you think about your spouse? Is that okay? Then they'll say, oh, if you're unmarried and you masturbate, it'll just excite your passions, and you should keep yourself pure. But there's nothing specifically saying in the Quran, thou shalt not diddle. It's not there. And there's also way more of a loophole for female homosexual behavior than it is for male homosexual behavior, because the story of Lot is in the Quran. He's called Lut in there. Muhammad had this thing for, this knack for taking these Hebrew names and making them sound more Arabic, and then claiming that Arabic was the true language. I kid you not. If you ask Muslims, they'll say Abraham, as you guys know him, he's actually Ibrahim. What? No, they didn't speak Arabic. That's just historically wrong. That's just a side note. But in the story of Lut in the Quran, there are men who, there's a specific description of men who lie with men as they lie with women, that they've forsaken their women and they're just partying with dudes all the time, constantly. And I'm thinking, how statistically likely is it for there to be a city that's exclusively comprised of gay men? How is that even possible? I mean, even San Francisco, there's some straight people there. I'm pretty sure. I've seen them holding hands. Some of them even have kids, so they probably had sex at least once, you'd imagine. But there's a prohibition there on male homosexuality, but for women and women, there's nothing specifically prohibiting it. The only way you can go about prohibiting female-female sexual relations and romantic relations in Islam is to go back to modesty law, where even in front of Muslim women or other women in general, Muslim women are supposed to stay a certain level of covered. There's an area called satr, which means like privacy or shame, and it's from your belly button to your knee, and that's for men and women. So Muslim men will wear those long shorts that kind of go below your knees. We call them the halal shorts. And seriously, it's the same way when I was a Muslim girl and we'd find long dresses without slits. I'd call every Muslim girl I knew, dude, Macy's has dresses without slits. Run, get them now. Their Muslim men will do that with the shorts. Dude, Macy's has long shorts. Go get them before they get sold out. There is a niche market waiting to happen. Corporate America, if you're listening, Muslim clothing stores, do it. Don't do it, actually. We want them to have to work hard. Because then it's all the sweeter when you get out of Islam and you're like, I can go shopping anywhere I want. If you're a size 6, of course. Go back to that. That's my new harem, right? So yeah, there's no specific prohibition on female homosexuality, although there is a prohibition on, showing your junk off to another woman. So you can go with that. People ask, why is it belly button to the knee? What about women's breasts? And the reason I was given that that's not included is because sometimes women breastfeed and they're in front of other women, so then part of their breast shows. So they didn't want to make it completely forbidden. There is no condoning of it either, though. There's no verse in the Quran that says lesbianism is cool. Obviously not. So there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of different ways that Muslims do Islam, and that's ultimately my message when it comes anytime I talk about Islam. Every Muslim does it differently, just like every Christian does it differently. And there are certain ways that they do it that are less harmful, and I'm a big fan of encouraging them to go that way. Because You know, I get accused of this all the time where Muslims will say, you only left because you wanted to slut it up and drink a bunch. I said, no, that came well after I left. That was like a good 6 months to a year. I kid you not, I was a scarf-wearing atheist for 3 months. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to do my hair or be without a headscarf. And then I just wore jeans and hoodies because I didn't know what else to wear. And then slowly progressed to the sleeveless dress you see today. Yeah. So what does this all mean? Muslims do sexuality differently. Muslim women express their sexuality despite, you know, all the problems and erasure and oppression. I think it's really important that we do this in general as a society, but especially with Muslim women, is let them have agency. Let them speak for themselves. Give them a space to say what they have to say and express their feelings the way they feel them, rather than telling them how they should and shouldn't feel. Because that's what they're already having happen with Islam. Why go with the patriarchy? Why go with the patriarchal oppression that they're already subjected to? Why add to it? Let's go against the grain. Let's ask them how they feel. And there are people who are already doing that, and we can support their efforts. We should stay away from patronizing assumptions. I didn't deconvert because of the jerks that would tell me, oh, you must be so repressed and oppressed and stuff. You know? No, those guys who were being jerks, they didn't make me question my religion. It was my friends. Most of my friends in high school and college, and it's only now the significance of it dawned on me, were atheists and agnostics. Were people who were mostly unchurched and didn't care for religion. And they were my friends, and every night I would pray to God to forgive them because I wanted them to go to heaven with me because they were great people, better than most of the Muslim jerks I knew. And realizing and having them talk to me in an engaged, informed way. You know, they didn't come to me and say, oh man, your religion promotes pedophilia or whatever. They asked me intelligent questions. And guess what? I wanted to give them intelligent answers. I wasn't inclined to brush them off. That made me go research the Quran, and the rest is history. So staying away from patronizing assumptions and engaging with people and getting them to actually think critically about what it is they actually believe. Because trust me, there's a lot of Muslim women walking around who don't know what's in their religion. When I deconverted, a lot of Muslim women I knew would come up to me, the more moderate types, and say, why did you leave? And I quote verse after saying to them, they're like, whoa, I didn't know that was in there. Well, maybe you should go look before you say you believe in it. Let's not buy into Islam's erasure of female sexuality and female sexual agency. I understand there are people who say, let's not encourage progressives, let's encourage deconversion. But after trying to convince the people who love me, people in my family, that they are wrong and that religion's wrong, and they're more inclined to take me seriously because they think I'm smart and I'm part of their family, and to have them not deconvert, there are some people who are just going to stay. There are some people who are just going to stay Muslims. With them, the best we can do is edge them towards a better view of things, a less harmful view of things. We should, on the flip side of this, not grant exceptions to Western Muslims. Just because they're Muslims, obviously, if they do something that's misogynistic, harmful, we should call it out. It's not Islamophobic to do so, it's merely reality. What we should stay away from, of course, is the xenophobic rhetoric of the brown hordes coming with their oppression of women, which sounds like I'm exaggerating. No, I'm quoting. I'm actually quoting. So we have to be careful to make sure that we view our own society with the same critical lens, apply that same lens to other societies, and do criticism in a thoughtful way. Islam is just one part of the world. The Muslim world is not the entire world. And Muslims are not the only people in the whole world, and most of the world promotes patriarchy. So what we actually need to change in order for radical gender equality, for true equality on all fronts to happen, is to frame women as subjects in sexuality rather than exclusively as objects, no matter what society we live in. We do have time for Q&A, do we? Yep. I always make sure I have that. Okay, you right there. Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's why I was careful to say the national origins of the different women I mentioned. It's actually the opposite of my message to the idea that there's a monolithic Islam. Every country is different. Every Muslim country has different things, which is why I differentiated, the difference between Saudi Arabia and here. Muslim populations are different all over the world. Different countries that have Muslim populations do things differently. There's a world of difference between, say, Malaysia and Saudi Arabia. So yeah, there's definitely a cultural element to the way that Islam manifests itself in these countries. The only problem with that, though, is that Muslims will say things like, oh, I don't agree with culture, I'm all about religion. But of course their culture does play a role regardless of what they might say about that. So it is a definitely very complex issue, and I didn't really have the time to get into the specific differences of how each country does Islam. That's probably worth a book series, probably. But there's a lot of differences. And thank you for pointing that out. If anyone got the impression that I was saying that there is a Muslim world and it goes one way, there's not. When I say the Muslim world, I use that term instead of ummah, which means Muslim community, because people are not familiar with that term. But I just mean the Muslims all over the world. And they all have different views and different ways of expressing those views, of course. I mean, even within my own family, there are women who cover their faces down to women who dress not much differently than me, and they call themselves Muslim, and they believe in Islam. So yeah, definitely that's a good point. You in the blue.
This is a question, but when you were mentioning how people make comments when you covered your head,
Mm-hmm.
I use that as a conversation opener and a moment of education or protective conversation.
That's assuming she doesn't already. I mean, especially a Muslim in America, I had to be more educated on other people's religions than they were. Because, people were constantly attacking me. And honestly, sometimes a Muslim woman just wants to go about her day. She doesn't want someone to find her interesting. She just wants to get her groceries and go home. So it's one thing if you're, say, on a college campus and you're hanging out, or you're in a class together, or you're in some social situation where it would be appropriate to ask. The thing is, it can get to be a pain to do Islam 101 constantly. It was a pain back then, it still is a pain now. I do it because this is what I do, but there's a lot of people who just want to go about their lives. And most Muslim women, especially in the West, because they have been challenged so many times on their covering, will have very thoughtful answers for you. But again, just be careful to not just every time you see a Muslim woman be like, hey, so like, why do you cover? Because, it's, sometimes you just want to live your life too.
But I don't put it as a question, I just say I find it interesting how various religions have different types of classes.
Yeah, but again, they may already be aware of that, and they may, again, feel hassled, and they get it a lot. Trust me, you're probably the 5th person that day to say something like that. So I'm not saying you have any bad intentions, I'm just saying that to me, I almost feel the same way about that as I do about the more benign forms of street harassment. Not the guys who yell in a violent way, but the guys who are like, oh, you look super pretty today. But if the 5th random stranger tells you, you have a nice smile or whatever, it gets weird. It gets to the point where you're like, what, can I just do my thing? What do you want from me? What do you want from me? So yeah, it can be almost a form of that, where women are often considered to be sort of public domain, where women are considered to be we can ask them questions and we can hassle them, where you wouldn't necessarily think of doing that with a man. So I'm not saying this is all your attention, I'm not putting this all on you, but I'm just saying it plays into this broader framework where sometimes women just want to live and be happy and not have to deal with constantly having to have conversations or questions. So I'd say do it thoughtfully and responsibly, just like any other drug. Do we have till? Okay, yeah, I guess one more question. Oh, yes, you were waiting so patiently.
So I want to know which prophet's harem did you want to be a part of?
Oh, I knew which one I wanted, okay? Joseph in the Quran is known as Yusuf, and in the Quran it says that Allah took all the beauty he would ever create in the entire universe. He split that in half and gave half to Yusuf. So guess who I wanted to bang?